The two small cribs sat side by side in the Wilsons' modest bedroom. It was spring of 1942, and the world outside was caught in the flames of war. But in this quiet corner of Oak River, a small Midwestern town, life had just begun for two perfect little girls. Margaret and Martha Wilson came into the world 7 minutes apart on a rainy April morning. From their very first breaths, something special connected them, something deeper than just being twins. Rose Wilson watched her identical daughters, sleeping, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect harmony. She noticed it right away. When one baby stirred, the other would too, as if they shared the same dreams. Their father, Frank, a quiet man who worked at the local lumber mill, would marvel at how they would reach for each other even before they could properly see. "They know," Rose would tell the neighbors who came bearing casseroles and hand-knitted blankets. "Somehow they always know where the other one is." As the girls grew from babies to toddlers, they developed their own special way of talking. Words that made no sense to anyone else seemed to carry complete thoughts between them. Their pediatrician, Dr. Haynes, told their parents not to worry. "Twins often develop their own language," he explained during their 3-year checkup. "They'll grow out of it when they start school, but they never fully did." Even after learning to speak properly, Margaret and Martha maintained a connection that went beyond words. A single look could spark laughter between them, as if they'd shared a joke no one else could hear. The Wilson house sat at the end of Maple Street, with a big oak tree in the front yard and a tire swing that Frank hung when the girls turned 5. The sisters would take turns pushing each other, their identical giggles floating through the neighborhood. From their matching dresses to their honey-brown braids tied with the same colored ribbons, everything about them mirrored the other. Only their mother could tell them apart without hesitation. Margaret had a tiny freckle behind her right ear, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. School brought new challenges. Their teacher, Miss Powell, suggested separating them into different classrooms. "They need to develop as individuals," she told Rose and Frank at the parent-teacher meeting. "They rely too much on each other." But the experiment lasted only 3 days. Martha stopped speaking entirely, and Margaret developed a fever without any medical cause. When they were reunited, both recovered immediately, as if a vital connection had been restored. "Some bonds aren't meant to be broken," Rose told her husband that night as they watched the twins sleeping peacefully again in their shared bedroom. The most striking example of their connection came when they were 10. Margaret fell from the oak tree, breaking her arm. 2 miles away at a friend's house, Martha suddenly clutched her own arm and cried out in pain. When Rose came to pick her up, Martha asked, "Maggie's hurt, isn't she?" before anyone had said a word about the accident. As teenagers in the late 1950s, the twins faced the typical pressures to conform. Their high school was filled with girls trying to look like movie stars, experimenting with makeup and curling their hair. But Margaret and Martha maintained their simple, identical styles, two sides of the same coin in a world that pushed for individuality. "Don't you want to be your own person?" their friend Nancy asked one day while flipping through a fashion magazine. "How will boys tell you apart?" Martha shrugged. "The right ones will know." But the right ones never seemed to come along. They went to dances and social events, but romantic relationships never lasted. Any boyfriend who tried to come between them, who asked for exclusive time with just one twin, quickly discovered the unbreakable nature of their bond. After graduating high school in 1960, both sisters enrolled at the State Teachers College. They roomed together, took the same classes, and graduated with identical grades. When they returned to Oak River, they were hired at the elementary school, Margaret teaching 3rd grade and Martha teaching 4th. The children of Oak River grew up with the Wilson twins as a town fixture. For nearly 4 decades, generations, of students passed through their classrooms. While they taught different grades, their teaching styles were remarkably similar, firm but kind, with a special talent for drawing out the quietest children. Both had a habit of tilting their heads slightly when listening to a student's question, as if giving that child their complete attention was the most important task in the world. Their parents aged, and the twins cared for them with unwavering dedication. Frank passed away from a heart attack in 1981, and Rose followed 5 years later. The sisters inherited the family home, where they had been born and raised, and continued living there together, its rooms filled with memories of their shared life. Neither sister ever married. When asked about it by curious students or nosy neighbors, they would simply smile and say they already had all the companionship they needed. Some people whispered that it was strange, two women living their entire lives together like that. Others found it touching, a bond so deep that nothing could come between them. As they grew older, their connection seemed to intensify. If Martha developed a cough, Margaret would feel a tickle in her throat the next day. When Margaret's vision began to blur, requiring reading glasses, Martha made an appointment with the optometrist before her own symptoms became apparent. "It's like they're one person in two bodies," said Harriet Green, who had been their neighbor for over 50 years. "I've never seen anything like it." The twins retired from teaching on the same day in 2002, after touching the lives of more than 2,000 children. The school held a joint retirement party, where former students spanning 4 decades came to share stories about the Wilson sisters and how they had shaped their lives. Tom Peterson, who became a teacher himself, stood up and told everyone, "Miss Margaret taught me to read when I thought I couldn't. She never gave up on me, even when I'd given up on myself." Lisa Wong, now a doctor, shared how Miss Martha had encouraged her interest in science. She brought in a microscope when no one else thought girls should be bothered with such things. In retirement, the twins established a comfortable routine. They tended their garden together, volunteered at the library reading program, and attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew their family had occupied for generations. Their hair had turned silver, and fine lines marked their faces, but they aged in perfect sync, as they had done everything else in life. Their 80th birthday was celebrated with a town gathering at the community center. The mayor presented them with a plaque honoring their contribution to Oak River, and former students of all ages came to pay their respects. The twins, dressed in matching blue dresses, looked around the room with tears in their eyes, overwhelmed by the impact they had made. "We never did anything special," Margaret told a local reporter covering the event. "We just lived our lives the best way we knew how." "Together," Martha added, finishing her sister's thought as she had done countless times before. 3 years later, as winter gave way to spring in 2025, Martha developed pneumonia. She insisted on staying home rather than going to the hospital, and Margaret cared for her, barely sleeping as she monitored her sister's fever and breathing. Dr. Linda Chen, who had taken over Dr. Haynes's practice decades ago, visited the house daily. After examining Martha, she pulled Margaret aside. "You need to rest," she warned. "Your blood pressure is elevated and you're exhausting yourself." Margaret shook her head. "I'm fine as long as Martha needs me." But she wasn't fine. As Martha's condition worsened, Margaret began experiencing chest pains. She ignored them, focused entirely on her sister's care. When Martha's breathing became labored one evening, Margaret called Dr. Chen in a panic. By the time the doctor arrived, Martha had slipped into unconsciousness. "We need to get her to the hospital now," Dr. Chen insisted. As the ambulance arrived, Margaret suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed beside her sister's bed. The paramedics found themselves with 2 patients instead of 1. At the hospital, the sisters were placed in the same room at Dr. Chen's insistence. Martha never regained consciousness, passing peacefully in her sleep just after midnight. Margaret, seemingly stable after treatment for what doctors diagnosed as a stress-induced cardiac episode, opened her eyes briefly when the monitors attached to her sister flatlined. "She's gone," she whispered, though no one had told her. "I can feel it." The nurse on duty began to explain that everything possible had been done, but Margaret just smiled faintly and closed her eyes. 7 hours later, her own heart simply stopped beating, despite there being no medical reason for her sudden decline. Dr. Chen later told the local paper, "In my 40 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like it. It was as if once one sister left this world, the other had no reason to stay." The news spread through Oak River like wildfire, The Wilson twins, who had lived as one, had died as one too. The town fell into mourning for the sisters who had been part of its fabric for over 8 decades. As arrangements for a joint funeral began, no one could have imagined what secrets the inseparable twins had kept hidden all their lives. Secrets that would soon change everything everyone thought. They knew about Margaret and Martha Wilson. The morning after the Wilson twins passed away, Oak River woke to a different kind of silence. The news traveled from porch to porch, store to store, classroom to classroom. Margaret and Martha Wilson, the twins who had taught generations of the town's children, were gone. Harriet Green, their neighbor of 50 years, stood at her kitchen window staring at the Wilson house. The curtains were drawn, and the porch light that the twins always left on at night remained glowing despite the morning sun. It seemed wrong somehow that life should continue without them. "I just spoke with Martha on Tuesday," Harriet told her husband as she wiped away tears. "She gave me a jar of her strawberry preserves, said they'd made too many." At Oak River Elementary, Principal Dorothy Clark called an emergency assembly. Many of the teachers had been students of the Wilson twins themselves before becoming colleagues. When Dorothy announced the news, audible gasps and quiet sobs echoed through the gymnasium. "Margaret and Martha Wilson shaped this school," Dorothy said, her voice wavering. "Their dedication to education and to each child who passed through their classrooms has left a mark on this community that will never fade." The school janitor, Henry Powell, who had worked there for 35 years, stood in the back with his cap in his hands. The twins had always left him homemade cookies during the holidays with a note thanking him for keeping their classrooms so clean. He couldn't imagine the school without them. By noon, the local florist had received so many orders for the funeral that she had to call suppliers in neighboring towns. The phone at Pearson's funeral home rang constantly as former students and friends called to ask when they could pay their respects. Paul Pearson, the funeral director, had known the Wilson sisters all his life. His father had handled their parents' funerals, and now it fell to him to take care of Margaret and Martha. He drove to the hospital to meet with Dr. Chen and arrange for the sisters to be brought to the funeral home. "I've never seen anything quite like it," Dr. Chen told him as they stood outside the room where the twins' bodies lay. Martha went first, and it was as if Margaret simply decided to follow her. Medically speaking, there was no reason for her heart to stop. Paul nodded solemnly. "They came into this world together. I suppose it makes sense they'd leave it the same way." Back at the funeral home, Paul's wife Judith helped him prepare the initial arrangements. "We'll need to contact their next of kin," she said, flipping through their records. "As far as I know, they don't have any close relatives left," Paul replied. "Their parents are long gone and neither of them ever married." Judith frowned. "There must be someone. Let me check the town records." After some digging, Judith discovered that the twins did have one living relative, a second cousin named Robert Thatcher who lived in Columbus, Ohio. His mother had been their mother's cousin. It wasn't much of a connection, but he was the closest thing to family they had left. Paul made the call, reaching Robert at his accounting office. "Mr. Thatcher, I'm sorry to inform you about your cousins, Margaret and Martha Wilson." There was a pause on the line. "The twins? I haven't seen them since my mother's funeral 15 years ago. As their only living relative, you would be responsible for making the final arrangements and handling their estate," Paul explained gently. Another long pause. "I see," Robert finally said. "I'll drive down tomorrow morning." Meanwhile, the Wilson house sat empty and still. The twins' tabby cat, Chester, prowled from room to room, meowing occasionally as if searching for his owners. Harriet Green noticed him in the window and called her husband. "We need to get that poor cat some food," she said. The twins would be heartbroken if anything happened to Chester. Using the spare key the sisters had given her years ago for emergencies, Harriet entered the silent house. Everything was neat and orderly, just as the twins had always kept it. 2 teacups sat, washed and upturned on a dish towel by the sink. A crossword puzzle, half completed, lay on the coffee table with 2 identical pairs of reading glasses beside it. Harriet fed Chester, then stood in the middle of the living room, overwhelmed by the feeling that she was intruding somehow. Photos of the twins throughout their lives lined the walls. As babies, as young teachers at their retirement party, Always together, always identical smiles. She wiped away a tear and locked up, promising Chester she'd be back to check on him. Robert Thatcher arrived in Oak River the next morning. He was a tall, balding man in his 50s with a serious expression and practical manner. He checked into the town's only motel and then drove directly to the funeral home, where Paul Pearson was waiting for him. "The whole town is in mourning," Paul explained as he showed Robert the guest book already filling with names. "Your cousins touched many lives here." Robert nodded, somewhat uncomfortable with the outpouring of emotion for women he barely knew. "I need to see about their house and belongings," he said. "I assume they left a will?" Paul directed him to Lawrence Bennett, the local attorney who had handled the twins' legal matters. Lawrence's office was just down the street above the hardware store, in a building that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. The elderly attorney greeted Robert with a firm handshake. "The Wilsons were very organized," Lawrence said, pulling out a file. "They updated their will every 5 years like clockwork. Last one was just 8 months ago. The will was simple. The house and all its contents were to be left to each other, with the surviving twin having full ownership. Since they had passed together, the secondary provisions applied. The house was to be sold, with the proceeds divided between the local library, the elementary school, and the church. Their modest savings would go to a scholarship fund for students pursuing teaching careers. Robert was named executor, a responsibility he accepted with a nod. "There's no inheritance for me?" he asked, trying not to sound disappointed. Lawrence gave him a sympathetic look. "They did leave you their mother's pearl necklace and their father's pocket watch, as you're the last of the family line. There's also a provision for executor fees." After leaving the attorney's office, Robert drove to the Wilson house. He sat in his car for a moment, looking at the 2-story white house with green shutters. He had visited maybe 3 times in his entire life, the last time being when he was a teenager. His mother had kept in touch with her cousins through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, but the connection had always been distant. Using the key Lawrence had given him, Robert entered the house and was greeted by Chester rubbing against his legs. The cat looked up at him with accusing eyes as if asking where his people had gone. "I don't know what to do with you," Robert muttered, stepping around the cat. He spent the afternoon going through the main rooms, taking inventory of furniture and valuables for the estate sale that would eventually happen. The house was filled with antique furniture, well maintained but nothing extraordinarily valuable. The twins had lived modestly on their teachers' salaries and pensions. As the day wore on, Robert found himself drawn into their lives through the objects they'd kept. Photo albums carefully labeled by year, handmade quilts stored in cedar chests, collections of children's thank you notes bundled with ribbons, a drawer full of matching gloves and scarves. Everything in pairs, everything shared. By evening, Robert had worked his way up to the 2nd floor. The twins' bedroom contained twin beds with identical quilts. Their closet held rows of similar outfits, often the same style in different colors. On their dresser sat matching silver hairbrushes, gifts from their students on their 30th year of teaching according to the engraving. The last room Robert checked was the small attic space, accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. He climbed up, tugging on a string to illuminate a single bare bulb. The attic was surprisingly clean and organized. Christmas decorations in labeled boxes, old teaching materials, their parents' belongings. As Robert was about to climb back down, his eye caught something in the far corner, partially hidden under an old quilt. It was a chest, old and made of dark wood with metal bands. Unlike everything else in the attic, it was locked with a heavy padlock. Robert pulled the chest out, surprised by its weight. It wasn't especially large, about the size of a small coffee table, but solid and well made. The padlock was tarnished but sturdy. He searched nearby boxes for a key but found nothing. The next morning, Robert mentioned the chest to Paul Pearson when he stopped by the funeral home to discuss arrangements. "A locked chest in the attic?" Paul looked intrigued. "I've known the Wilson sisters all my life, and I've never heard them mention anything like that." "I'm curious what's inside," Robert admitted. "It seems odd that it was hidden away and locked. When they were so organized about everything else, Paul thought for a moment. You know, you might want to talk to Bill Henderson at the hardware store. He's good with locks. Might be able to help you open it without damaging an antique chest. That afternoon, Bill Henderson came to the house with his tools. He was a stocky man in his 60s who had taken over the hardware store from his father. My wife had both Miss Margaret and Miss Martha in school, Bill said as he examined the lock. Finest teachers Oak River ever had. The lock was old but not particularly sophisticated. After some careful work with his picks, Bill managed to open it without damage. There you go, he said, stepping back. Whatever secrets the Wilson twins kept, they're all yours now. Robert thanked him and waited until Bill had left before turning back to the chest. He felt a strange reluctance now that the moment had come. Whatever was inside had been important enough for the twins to keep locked away their entire lives. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside, the chest was filled to the brim with papers, photographs, and small objects wrapped in cloth. On top lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. The paper yellowed with age. Robert carefully picked up the bundle. The letters were written in a language he didn't recognize. Not English, with strange accents and markings over the letters. Beneath the letters were photographs of people he didn't know. A man and woman standing stiffly in formal clothes. Another of the same couple with two identical baby girls. The photos were clearly old, from the 1930s or earlier, but well preserved. Deeper in the chest, Robert found documents with official-looking stamps and seals. Some had swastikas on them, sending a chill down his spine. At the very bottom of the chest was a leather-bound journal. When he opened it, he found page after page of writing in what appeared to be some kind of code or cipher, not matching any language he recognized. Robert sat back on his heels, staring at the contents spread around him. Who were these people in the photos? What did these documents mean? Why had the Wilson twins kept all this hidden? The funeral was scheduled for the day after tomorrow, but Robert knew he couldn't proceed without understanding what he'd found. Whatever secrets Margaret and Martha had kept locked in this chest might change everything about how they were remembered. He gathered the most important-looking documents and the journal, placed them carefully in his briefcase, and went to find someone who might help him uncover the truth about the Wilson twins. Robert sat in his motel room that evening, the contents of the chest spread across the bed. The photographs, the strange documents, the coded journal. He couldn't make sense of any of it. Who were these people, and what connection did they have to Margaret and Martha? Why had the twins kept these items locked away for decades? He picked up one of the photographs again, a formal portrait of a couple, probably in their 30s. The woman wore a modest dress with a pearl necklace, her hair styled in the fashion of the 1930s. The man stood straight in a dark suit, his expression serious but kind. On the back, written in fading ink, were words Robert couldn't understand, along with a date, Warsaw, 1938. Warsaw, Robert said aloud. Warsaw? Poland? He turned to another photo. The same couple, this time with two identical baby girls in white dresses. The babies couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Something about their faces tugged at Robert's memory. He reached for his wallet and pulled out the only photo he had of his cousins, a Christmas card they had sent his mother years ago. Placing the photos side by side, he studied the faces. The resemblance was unmistakable. The babies in the old photograph were Margaret and Martha. But the couple, they weren't Frank and Rose Wilson. Robert rubbed his tired eyes. He needed help from someone who could make sense of these documents and perhaps translate the foreign language. He remembered Paul Pearson mentioning that Oak River had a small historical society. Perhaps someone there could help. The next morning, Robert called the number Paul had given him and reached Eleanor Fletcher, the head of the Oak River Historical Society. She agreed to meet him at the society's office, located in a converted Victorian house near the town square. Eleanor was in her 70s, a retired librarian with silver hair tied back in a neat bun and sharp blue eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. She dedicated her retirement to preserving the town's history. I knew the Wilson twins well, she said, as she welcomed Robert into the cluttered office. I worked with them on the library board for years. Such lovely women. Robert placed his briefcase on the desk and began taking out the items he'd found. I discovered something unusual while going through their house. I'm hoping you can help me make sense of it. Eleanor's eyes widened as Robert laid out the photographs and documents. She picked up one of the official-looking papers with the Nazi stamp. This is in German, she said, frowning. It appears to be some kind of government document from the Third Reich era. She studied a few more papers. And these others are in Polish, I believe. I don't speak either language fluently, but I recognize them. Robert showed her the journal with its strange writing. And what about this? It doesn't look like any language I've seen. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and flipped through several pages. This isn't a foreign language, it's a cipher, a code. She looked up at Robert with surprise. The Wilson twins created a secret code when they were children. Many of the town's children knew about it because they would sometimes use it to write special birthday messages for their students. Can you read it? Robert asked hopefully. Eleanor shook her head. No one could except the twins themselves. They never taught it to anyone. She closed the journal carefully. Robert, I think we need more expert help with these documents. There's someone you should meet. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in the living room of Dr. Howard Bernstein, a professor emeritus from the State University, who had retired to Oak River 5 years ago. In his late 70s, he had thick white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Before retiring, he'd been a professor of European history, specializing in World War II. These are remarkable documents, Dr. Bernstein said, examining them carefully on his dining room table. This one here is a German travel document from 1939, and these others are Polish identification papers. He looked at the photographs, then at Robert. Where did you find these? Robert explained about the locked chest in the attic of the Wilson home. They belong to my cousins Margaret and Martha Wilson. They passed away this week. Dr. Bernstein nodded solemnly. Yes, I heard about their passing. I didn't know them well, but their reputation in this town was legendary. He turned back to the documents. What you have here tells a very different story than what most people in town probably know about the Wilson twins. Eleanor leaned forward. What do you mean? These Polish documents, Dr. Bernstein said, pointing to several papers, they contain the name Wiśniewski. And this German document appears to be transit papers for 2 children, twins, to leave Poland in late 1939, just after the Nazi invasion began. Robert felt a chill. Are you saying Margaret and Martha weren't Wilsons? Dr. Bernstein looked at him over his glasses. Based on these documents, it appears your cousins were born Małgorzata and Marta Wiśniewski. They were Polish. And given the timing and these particular documents, almost certainly Jewish children smuggled out of Poland just before the Holocaust began. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Eleanor was the first to speak. All these years, she whispered, they never said a word. The question is, Robert said slowly, did they know? Or was this something their parents, the Wilsons, kept from them? Dr. Bernstein tapped the journal. I believe this might hold the answer. You said it's written in their private code? Eleanor nodded. A twin language they developed as children and maintained throughout their lives. No one else could read it. Then, we need to try to break the code, Dr. Bernstein said. I had some experience with cryptography during my academic work. With your permission, Robert, I'd like to try. Robert agreed immediately. The funeral is tomorrow afternoon. If these documents reveal something important about Margaret and Martha's true identity, I feel we owe it to them to understand before they're laid to rest. Dr. Bernstein nodded. I'll do my best. Eleanor, could you help? You knew them personally. You might recognize patterns or references I wouldn't catch. For the rest of the day and well into the night, Dr. Bernstein and Eleanor worked on deciphering the journal while Robert continued sorting through the chest's contents. They spread everything across Dr. Bernstein's dining room table, The photographs, the letters, the documents, looking for clues. The first step in breaking any code, Dr. Bernstein explained, is to look for patterns, certain letters or combinations that appear frequently. Eleanor noticed that some words appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. "This symbol here," she said, pointing to a squiggly mark that looked like a combination of letters. "It appears at the beginning of many entries. Could it be a date marker?" "Good thinking," Dr. Bernstein agreed. "And look here. These entries all begin with the same sequence of symbols, almost like Dear Diary." They worked methodically, creating charts of symbol frequencies and looking for words they could identify with certainty. By midnight, they had decoded a few common words: we, our, mother, father, enough to begin making sense of some passages. Around 2 in the morning, Robert, who had been dozing in an armchair, was awakened by Eleanor's gasp. "Howard, look at this entry," she said, her voice trembling. "If I'm reading it correctly..." Dr. Bernstein adjusted his glasses and read the passage she indicated. The color drained from his face. "What is it?" Robert asked, fully awake now. Dr. Bernstein looked up, his expression grave. "This entry is dated June 12, 1957. Margaret and Martha were 15 years old. If our translation is correct, it says, 'Today we found the papers in Father's desk. We are not who we thought we were. Our real parents sent us away to save us. We are the only ones who survived.'" Eleanor wiped away a tear. They knew. They knew all along. With renewed determination, they continued working through the journal, focusing on key entries. By dawn, they had deciphered enough to understand the basic outline of the twins' secret history. The journal revealed that in 1957, while looking for a school permission slip in their father's desk, Margaret and Martha had discovered their adoption papers and the documents from Poland. Frank and Rose Wilson had sat them down and told them the truth. They were the children of David and Hannah Wisniewski, a Jewish couple from Warsaw, who had managed to send their twin daughters to America just before the Nazi occupation made escape impossible. The Wisniewskis had been distant relatives of Rose Wilson's family. When they realized the danger they were in, they had arranged for their babies to be taken to America, where the Wilsons, who could not have children of their own, adopted them and gave them new names. Frank and Rose had told the girls that their birth parents had perished in the Holocaust, along with their extended family. The Wilsons had kept their origins secret out of fear. Oak River in the 1940s and 50s had little diversity and some prejudice. They had wanted to protect the girls from possible discrimination. One entry from 1957 read, "We have decided to keep our true identity secret, just as Mother and Father did. This is our home now. These are our people. But we will never forget where we came from or the parents who loved us enough to send us away." Another entry from decades later in 1985 revealed, "Today we donated again to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in memory of our birth parents. No one knows where the money comes from. It is better that way. In this small town, even now, being Jewish might change how people see us." As morning light filtered through Dr. Bernstein's windows, Robert sat back, overwhelmed by what they had discovered. They lived their entire lives keeping this secret. Why? Surely by the time they were adults, they could have revealed their true identity. Dr. Bernstein sighed deeply. You have to understand the times they grew up in. When they discovered their true origins in 1957, America was a different place. Anti-Semitism was still common, even if less overt than in earlier decades. And small. Towns like Oak River could be particularly set in their ways. And later, Robert asked, why keep it secret their whole lives? Eleanor put her hand on the journal gently. Because by then, they had become the Wilson twins. Everyone knew them that way. Perhaps they felt revealing the truth would somehow betray Frank and Rose, who had raised them with so much love. Or perhaps, Dr. Bernstein added quietly, they feared it would change how people saw them, not as the Wilson twins who had taught generations of children, but as something other, something foreign. Robert looked at the photographs again. The Polish couple who had given birth to Margaret and Martha, who had loved them enough to send them away, knowing they might never see them again. And the Wilson couple who had raised them as their own, keeping their origins secret to protect them. "What do I do with this information?" Robert asked finally. "The funeral is this afternoon. Do I tell everyone? Is that what Margaret and Martha would have wanted?" Eleanor and Dr. Bernstein exchanged looks. "That's something only you can decide," Eleanor said gently. "But these women kept this secret for over 65 years. There must have been a reason." Dr. Bernstein nodded. "Whatever you decide, Robert, remember that this was their story to tell. If you choose to share it now, do so with the dignity and respect they deserve." Robert stared at the journal, at the photographs, at all the pieces of a history he'd never known about his cousins. The funeral was just hours away. People would be gathering to say goodbye to Margaret and Martha Wilson, never knowing they had once been Małgorzata and Marta Wiśniewski. He had a decision to make, one that would affect not just how the twins would be remembered, but how their entire life story would be understood by everyone who had ever known them. Robert stood in front of the mirror in his motel room, adjusting his tie. The funeral would begin in 2 hours, and he still hadn't made his decision. Should he share what he'd discovered about Margaret and Martha's true identity? Or should he keep their secret, honoring the choice they'd made to live their entire lives as the Wilson twins? He'd barely slept after leaving Dr. Bernstein's house, his mind filled with the fragments of his cousin's hidden past. The photographs of their birth parents, the coded journal entries, the Holocaust documents, the pieces of a puzzle that completed a picture so different from what everyone in Oak River believed about their beloved teachers. His phone rang. It was Eleanor Fletcher. "Robert, Howard, and I continued working on the journal this morning," she said without preamble. "We've decoded more entries. I think you should come over before the funeral. There's something else you need to see." 20 minutes later, Robert was back in Dr. Bernstein's dining room. The professor looked tired with dark circles under his eyes, but there was an excitement in his expression. "We found something remarkable," Dr. Bernstein said, turning the journal to a specific page. "This entry from 1972. We've translated most of it." Robert leaned forward to read the decoded passage. "Today we finished our special lessons for the children about tolerance and understanding. We cannot tell them our own story, but we can teach them what we know to be true. That hatred based on differences is wrong." Martha cried during the reading of Anne Frank's diary to the class. The children noticed and asked why. How could we explain that we might have shared her fate if not for our parents' sacrifice? Instead, Martha told them that sad stories should make us cry, and that's how we know we still have our humanity. Eleanor pointed to another entry, this one from 1985. "We visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. during summer break. No one from Oak River knows we were there. We lit candles for our birth parents and all the Wiśniewskis who died. The museum had records. Our family was taken to Treblinka. None survived. We are the only ones left. On the way home, we talked about telling the truth after all these years. But what would be the purpose? To us, we are both Wiśniewskis and Wilsons. We honor both our families by living good lives and teaching children to be kind." Robert sat down heavily. They lived their whole lives with this knowledge, never telling anyone. "Not exactly," Dr. Bernstein said, turning to yet another page. "There's an entry from 1993 that mentions someone named Rabbi Cohen from the synagogue in the next county. It suggests they may have reconnected with their Jewish heritage privately, away from Oak River." "And look at this," Eleanor added, showing Robert a bundle of bank statements they'd found in the chest. For decades, they made anonymous donations to Jewish charities, Holocaust survivor groups, and refugee organizations, substantial amounts from their modest teacher salaries. Robert shook his head in wonder. So they acknowledged their heritage privately, while maintaining their public identity as the Wilson twins. "It seems they found a way to honor both parts of themselves," Dr. Bernstein said. "And there's more. We found entries describing how they subtly shaped their teaching to include lessons about tolerance, diversity, and standing up against prejudice. values directly influenced by their hidden history. Eleanor checked her watch. The funeral is in just over an hour. Have you decided what you're going to do? Robert looked at the materials spread across the table, the evidence of lives far more complex and remarkable than anyone in Oak River had known. I think I have, he said quietly. The First Methodist Church of Oak River was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out onto the steps outside. The Wilson twins had touched so many lives during their 8 decades in town that it seemed everyone had come to say goodbye. 2 simple caskets sat at the front of the church, identical in every way, just as the twins had been in life. They were surrounded by flowers, so many that their sweet scent filled the entire building. Robert sat in the front pew, next to Eleanor and Dr. Bernstein. He'd asked them both to join him, needing their support for what he was about to do. In his hands, he held a small leather-bound book, the journal, and a manila folder containing select photographs and documents. Pastor Williams, who had known the Wilson twins his entire life, they had taught him in elementary school, welcomed the gathering with warm words about Margaret and Martha's impact on the community. Former students shared touching memories. How Miss Margaret had stayed after school to help struggling readers. How Miss Martha had organized science fairs that inspired future doctors and engineers. Dorothy Clark, the elementary school principal, spoke about the twins' teaching legacy. They believed every child could learn, and more importantly, that every child deserved to be seen and valued. Their methods are still taught in our education courses at the State College. Finally, it was Robert's turn to speak. As the only family member present, he was expected to give the eulogy. He walked slowly to the pulpit, his heart pounding. Looking out at the sea of faces, many streaked with tears, all filled with love for his cousins, he took a deep breath. Thank you all for coming today, he began. As many of you know, I am Robert Thatcher, Margaret and Martha's cousin. I wish I could say I knew them well, but the truth is, I saw them only a handful of times throughout my life. It wasn't until they passed away that I was given the task of handling their estate and learning who they truly were. He paused, looking down at the journal in his hands. I thought I knew who Margaret and Martha Wilson were, the twin teachers of Oak River, the daughters of Frank and Rose Wilson, women who devoted their lives to education and never married. That's what we all thought we knew. A murmur ran through the congregation. Robert continued, his voice stronger now. 3 days ago, while going through their home, I discovered something unexpected. A locked chest in their attic, filled with documents, photographs, and this journal, written in a code only they could understand. He held up the journal so everyone could see it. With the help of Dr. Howard Bernstein and Eleanor Fletcher, we've decoded parts of this journal, and what we've learned has shown me that Margaret and Martha Wilson were even more extraordinary than any of us knew. Robert took another deep breath and revealed what they had discovered, that the beloved Wilson twins had been born Małgorzata and Marta Wisniewski in Warsaw, Poland. That they were Jewish children sent to America by parents desperate to save them from the coming Holocaust. That Frank and Rose Wilson, their adoptive parents, had raised them as their own, keeping their origins secret in a time when such differences might have made their lives difficult. A shocked silence fell over the church as Robert continued, explaining how the twins had discovered their true identity as teenagers, but had chosen to keep the secret their entire lives. But why would they hide this? Someone called out from the congregation. Robert nodded, acknowledging the question that was surely on everyone's mind. At first, it was likely out of respect for their adoptive parents' wishes. Later, perhaps it was easier to remain the people everyone knew them to be. But their journal reveals something remarkable. While they kept their Jewish heritage private, they never forgot it. They honored it in ways none of us could see. He described the anonymous donations to Holocaust memorials and Jewish charities, the private visits to synagogues in other towns, the subtle ways they had incorporated lessons about tolerance and standing up against hatred into their teaching. Margaret and Martha lived through a time when being different could make life very difficult, especially in a small town. They chose to keep their past private, but they used their experiences to shape generations of children in this community, teaching values of acceptance and kindness that many of you carry with you today. As Robert spoke, he could see the expressions on people's faces changing, from shock to understanding and then to something deeper. Many were nodding now, making connections they'd never seen before. Harriet Green, their neighbor of 50 years, stood up. That explains why they were so insistent on starting the annual Heritage Day at the elementary school back in the 1960s, where children learned about different cultures from around the world. Tom Peterson, a former student, raised his hand. And why they always had us read Number the Stars in the Diary of Anne Frank, even when some parents complained the material was too mature. More voices joined in, people remembering the twins' emphasis on treating everyone with dignity, their special history lessons about the dangers of prejudice, their quiet insistence that every child deserved respect regardless of background. Pastor, William stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Robert's shoulder. Margaret and Martha Wilson, or Wisniewski, lived lives of quiet courage and profound impact. They survived unimaginable loss as children, yet devoted themselves to ensuring other children would learn the values that might prevent such tragedies in the future. He turned to address the congregation. The fact that they kept this part of themselves private doesn't diminish who they were to this community. If anything, knowing their full story makes their contributions even more meaningful. Robert returned to his seat, emotionally drained, but certain he'd made the right decision. The service continued, with a hymn the twins had selected for their funeral years ago, Amazing Grace. As the beautiful melody filled the church, Robert noticed something remarkable happening. People were whispering to each other, sharing memories that suddenly made new sense. The high school history teacher recalled how the twins had helped establish the school's first Holocaust education curriculum. A town council member remembered their passionate advocacy for accepting refugee families during international crises. After the service, as people filed past the caskets to pay their final respects, many stopped to thank Robert for sharing the truth. "I had Miss Margaret for 3rd grade in 1975, a woman told him, wiping away tears. "She once told us that everyone has a story deeper than what we can see. I never understood what she meant until today." Bill Henderson, who had helped open the chest, shook Robert's hand firmly. "My grandfather was not a tolerant man," he said, quietly. "He probably would have treated them differently if he'd known. But they changed this town, generation by generation. My kids don't think the way he did. Maybe that was their true legacy." As people began to leave the church, preparing to follow the hearses to the cemetery, Dr. Bernstein approached Robert. "There's one more thing in the journal we decoded this morning," he said. "An entry from just last year. I think you should read it before the burial." He handed Robert a piece of paper with the translated entry. Robert read it silently, tears filling his eyes. "We have lived long lives, fuller than we had any right to expect when we arrived in America as babies with nothing but the clothes we wore. Our birth parents gave us life twice, once when we were born and again when they sent us away to save us. Our American parents gave us love and a home when we had none. We have tried to honor them all through how we lived. If there comes a time after we are gone when our true story is discovered, we hope it will be understood as a story not of deception, but of survival, adaptation, and quiet resistance against hatred. We are Wisniewskis and Wilsons both. We are Jewish women who taught generations of Christian children. We are immigrants who became as American as anyone born on this soil. We contain multitudes, as do all people, if only others would look closely enough to see." Robert folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. As he walked out of the church into the bright afternoon sunlight, he knew that Margaret and Martha, or Malgorzata and Marta, would be remembered not just for who everyone thought they were, but for who they truly had been all along. The day after the funeral, Oak River felt different. The news about Margaret and Martha's true identity had spread beyond those who attended the service, traveling through phone calls and over backyard fences until it seemed everyone in town was talking about the Wilson twins, or the Wisniewski twins, as some had already begun to call them. Robert woke early in his motel room, emotionally drained but certain he'd made the right decision. His phone had been buzzing with messages since yesterday. distant relatives he barely knew, journalists from the county newspaper, and many of the townsfolk wanting to share memories or ask questions. After a quick breakfast, he drove to the IEC Wilson house to continue sorting through his cousin's belongings. As he pulled into the driveway, he was surprised to see several cars parked along the street and a small group of people gathered on the front lawn. Harriet Green waved to him from the porch where she was setting down a casserole dish. "Hope you don't mind," she called out. "We thought you could use some help today." Inside, Robert found half a dozen people already at work. Bill Henderson from the hardware store was fixing a loose banister on the staircase. Dorothy Clark, the elementary school principal, was carefully wrapping photo frames in newspaper. Two elderly women he recognized from the funeral were organizing the kitchen cabinets. "We all wanted to help," Dorothy explained, seeing Robert's surprised expression. "After what we learned yesterday, well, it feels like we owe it to them." Throughout the morning, more people arrived, bringing food, sharing stories, and helping with the enormous task of sorting through a lifetime of possessions. With each item they handled, books filled with margin notes, handmade quilts, collections of students' thank you letters, the twins' presence seemed to fill the house. Around noon, Pastor Williams stopped by with Eleanor Fletcher and Dr. Bernstein. The pastor looked slightly uncomfortable as he approached Robert. "I've been thinking a lot about what we learned yesterday," he said. "The Wilson twins attended my church every Sunday for decades. They taught Sunday school. And yet, they kept this essential part of themselves hidden, their Jewish heritage." Paused, struggling to find the right words. "I wonder if they felt they couldn't share that truth with us, with me. If our community somehow failed them." Dr. Bernstein, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I don't think they saw it that way, Pastor. From what we've decoded in their journal, they didn't feel they were living a lie. They built a life that honored both parts of their identity, the Jewish children they were born as and the Christian women they were raised to be." Eleanor nodded in agreement. They found their own way to reconcile these different aspects of themselves. "Remember that entry from last year? We are Wisniewskis and Wilsons both." The conversation paused as Bill Henderson called out from the living room, "Robert, you might want to see this." They all gathered around as Bill pointed to something he'd discovered while moving a bookcase, a small door, almost like a cabinet, built into the wall behind it. It had been completely hidden by the heavy piece of furniture. "I've known this house since I was a kid," Bill said, scratching his head. "Never knew this was here." The tiny door wasn't locked. Inside the hidden compartment was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with intricate floral patterns. Robert carefully lifted it out, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Everyone watched in silence as he opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a silver menorah. Beside it lay two small prayer books with Hebrew lettering on their covers and a folded piece of paper. Robert unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was a letter, handwritten in English in a careful, elegant script. "To whoever finds this, after we are gone. If you are reading this, then the secret we kept for most of our lives has finally come to light. We are not ashamed of our heritage, we are proud of it. We kept this menorah hidden not out of shame, but because it is the only object we have that truly connects us to our birth parents and our Jewish roots. When we were sent to America as babies, this menorah was hidden in our traveling basket, wrapped in blankets. It was a piece of our family's history, meant to remind us of who we were, even if we were too young to understand. Frank and Rose Wilson were good, loving people who gave us a home when we had none. They raised us in their Christian faith out of love, not to erase our past. When we discovered our true origins as teenagers, they supported our desire to learn about our Jewish heritage, though they asked us to be discreet in a town that might not understand. Each year on the first night of Hanukkah, we would close our curtains, move the bookcase, and light this menorah in private remembrance of our birth family and all those lost in the Holocaust. It was our way of honoring where we came from, even as we embraced the life and community we had here. We don't know who will find this or what Oak River will be like when our story is finally known. We hope for understanding. We hope our students will remember what we tried to teach them, that every person contains depths and complexities beyond what others can see, and that these differences should be respected, not feared. Margaret and Martha Wilson, Małgorzata and Marta Wiśniewski. The room was silent as Robert finished reading. Pastor Williams wiped tears from his eyes. Dr. Bernstein gently touched the menorah, his fingers tracing the ancient symbol with reverence. All those years, Harriet whispered. Right here in this house. A whole part of their lives we never knew about. The discovery of the menorah and the letter spread through town even faster than the initial revelation had. By evening, it seemed to have sparked something unexpected in Oak River, a period of collective self-reflection. 3 days later, as Robert was preparing to return to Columbus, having made arrangements for an estate sale and the distribution of his cousin's assets, according to their will, he was surprised by a knock at his motel door. Dorothy Clark stood there with several other community members behind her. The mayor, the high school principal, Pastor Williams, and a few others he recognized from the funeral. Robert, we've been talking, Dorothy said. We don't want Margaret and Martha's story to fade away once you leave. We want to do something meaningful to honor their full legacy. They explained their idea. The establishment of a scholarship fund in the name of Margaret and Martha Wiśniewski Wilson. It would support students pursuing teaching careers, with special consideration for those interested in promoting tolerance and diversity in education. We've already raised nearly $15,000, the mayor said proudly. Once word got out, donations started pouring in from current and former students all over the country. Robert was touched. That's a wonderful tribute. They would have appreciated that. There's more, Pastor Williams added. We're organizing an interfaith memorial service next month. We've invited Rabbi Cohen from the synagogue in the next county, the one mentioned in their journal. We want to honor both aspects of who they were. As his final day in Oak River drew to a close, Robert made one last visit to the Wilson house. Most of it had been packed up now, with furniture tagged for the estate sale and personal mementos set aside for donation to the school's historical display. He stood in the empty living room, trying to imagine his cousins there, two identical women going about their daily lives, carrying both their painful history and their hopeful future with quiet dignity. He wished he had known them better. He wished he had asked them about their lives while they were still here to tell their own story. The front door opened and Eleanor Fletcher stepped in. I thought I might find you here, she said. There's something I want to show you before you leave. She handed him a large manila envelope. Inside was a thick stack of papers, more translated entries from the twins' journal that she and Dr. Bernstein had completed over the past few days. We worked around the clock, she explained. We wanted to give you as much of their story as possible. Robert thanked her, deeply moved by the gesture. That night in his motel room, he read through the translated entries, getting to know his cousins through their own private thoughts and reflections over the decades. One entry from 1998 particularly stood out. We attended Brian Cooper's college graduation today. He was our student 20 years ago, a shy boy who struggled to read. Now he's becoming a teacher himself and told us we were his inspiration. It's strange to think of the invisible threads that connect us all. His life was shaped by ours, just as ours was shaped by our birth parents whom we never knew, and by Frank and Rose who raised us. We are all products of both our roots and our choices. Perhaps that is the most important lesson we could ever teach. The next morning, Robert packed his car and prepared to leave Oak River. As he drove down Main Street for the last time, he noticed something that made him slow down. The town's welcome sign, which had always read Oak River founded 1887, a traditional American community, now had a new banner beneath it. Home of Margaret and Martha Wilson Wiśniewski. Their story is our story. He smiled and continued, driving, knowing that his cousin's legacy was in good hands. Back in Columbus, Robert returned to his accounting job and his regular routine, but something had changed within him. He found himself thinking often about identity, heritage, and the power of both secrecy and revelation. He began researching his family history, curious about his own connections to the past. 2 months later, he received a thick envelope from Oak River. Inside was a program from the Interfaith Memorial Service, photos of the scholarship presentation. To its first recipient, a young woman planning to teach Holocaust studies, and dozens of letters from former students and community members sharing memories of the Wilson twins. There was also a newspaper clipping from the Oak River Gazette. The article described how the elementary school had established a new annual tradition, Wisniewski-Wilson Day, dedicated to celebrating diverse cultural heritages and teaching children about the dangers of prejudice. The most meaningful item, however, was a photograph of the twins' gravestone. Robert had ordered a simple marker before leaving town, but what stood in the cemetery now was different. A beautiful stone with both their American and Polish Jewish names engraved. Side by side, along with a quote from their journal, "We contain multitudes, as do all people, if only others would look closely enough to see." Beneath the photo was a handwritten note from Eleanor. The whole town contributed. We wanted them to rest with their full truth acknowledged at last. Robert pinned the photo to his bulletin board where he would see it every day, a reminder of the extraordinary women whose final gift to their community was the truth of their lives, revealed only after they had gone. In the years that followed, the story of the Wilson twins became something of a legend in Oak River and beyond. A documentary, filmmaker from the State University, interviewed people who had known them, creating a permanent record of their impact. The chest and its contents were donated to the Holocaust Museum, along with copies of their decoded journal, ensuring that future generations would know their remarkable journey. But perhaps their greatest legacy lived on in the hundreds of students they had taught over their long careers, students who grew up hearing their teachers emphasize the importance of seeing beyond differences, of standing up against injustice, of recognizing the humanity in everyone. As one former student put it in the documentary, Miss Margaret and Miss Martha never told us their own story. Instead, they helped us write better stories for ourselves, stories of understanding, acceptance, and courage. In the end, that was the most powerful lesson they could have taught us.